So here we go. We're back on the strike boat, and no pun intended for the Montreal Port. We've got winter looming. I know y'all don't want to talk about it, but the fact is we're almost at that protect from freeze. We've got chains going on. We've got stuff happening in the Northwest. And today on the Logistics Life, we've got the main man, Dean Crook, who's going to tell us all about it. Hey, everybody. Welcome back. Dean, my man. So it's interesting when you sent me the message this morning saying, let's talk about protect from freezers, like snowstorms. I went, oh, already?
Yeah.
And I'm like so excited because I'm hearing, I mean, you know, gosh, I say it all the time, and I know it's such a cliche, but meteorologists are the only ones that can get things wrong all the time and still keep their jobs.
Yeah.
Like if we were wrong this much in logistics, man, we'd be, you know, I'd be packing bags at a grocery store. I tell you, and not that there's anything wrong with that. For whoever's packing bags, don't go there. But you know, I hear this, and I get excited every year, and I'm constantly telling Christine that, you know, if there's no snow this year, I think it's my last year of snowmobiling because I get so excited about winter. Don't get me wrong, I hate shoveling, I hate snow blowing, but I love the snow. Right? It's this love-hate relationship.
Yeah.
Hear somebody else say, and they're like, oh yeah, I hear this winter's supposed to be like last winter. And I'm like, okay, come on, stop swearing.
Yeah.
And you were telling me there's already been severe storms in the Northwest.
Yeah. Wyoming, mostly.
Yeah.
I drove across that stretch last year between Rawlings and Laramie. When you get out into Wyoming, there are some of the most spectacular country, but you're really high. I don't know if you haven't driven it, you're really high up, not a lot of vegetation, a lot of sort of plateaus, mesas, but just winding roads up and down through hills, and it's pretty barren. So the wind just whips across there like you wouldn't believe. But, you know, after a prolonged period of unseasonably warm weather, things got pretty cold over the last few days, and I-80, they got into a fair bit of trouble out there. I think it caught a lot of people by surprise. You know, the usual suspects, you know, in terms of road closures. Dan, what struck me was when I drove I-80, which is a massive interstate for truckload carriers, they have those gates, the big gates that come down to shut the highway off.
Yes.
Right. So when you know you're in serious territory when you have big boom gates that can shut down a whole interstate. So they called it that moderate to high impacts of heavy snow, blowing snow, reduced visibility, slick roads, et cetera, today and yesterday. So, you know, what that means is a lot of carriers will be caught short. They won't have their chains under their trailers or on the chassis. There'll be service failures because people will be late with loads. Worst case scenario, there's accidents, and that's something that I think is inevitable these days with a lot of inexperienced drivers on the road, that this may be their first winter, and that'll catch a lot of people by surprise. And I think for those that are in the capacity buying business, the miles get harder and they get slower. So you've got to add in a factor for more service failures, more delays, things getting held up, you know, maybe a day, maybe a few hours, but service failures are inevitable, I think, as we get to this time of the year. Dan, this is a lot earlier than I expected. I didn't expect it to hit this hard. My son's.
I was just going to ask you if it was normal at this time of year, because I thought maybe mid-month next month, almost like we're kind of 2-3 weeks earlier than it would normally be.
Yeah, a bit early. But then we've been having pretty crazy weather patterns for the last few years, which is, you know, we had Heather Dawn from Dawn Transfer on our IQ show a month ago talking about Protect from Freeze. And she said over the last 5 years, we've seen some absolutely crazy weather patterns that have forced them to rethink how they handle cold weather in a shipper sense, you know, adding Protect from Freeze to bills of lading. So again, weather's here. There'll be a lot of people unprepared. We'll have the classic, inevitable, tragic whiteouts, multi-vehicle pileups, because most truckers don't have CB radios on these days. In fact, large fleets encourage trucks not to have them as an added distraction. Unfortunately, when you get into cold weather, it's a life-saving device. So I think there'll be a lot of drivers sort of oblivious to what's going on around them, especially those that haven't experienced what winter's like. And Dan, you and I see it. You would see it on 401. I see it on interstates 100%. Here. Mm-hmm. When it's snowing, like you don't have a lot of traction in a truck, loaded or empty. No. Worse when you're empty. But I've seen drivers going as fast in a loaded truck as you would on a dry road on interstates. And I kind of scratch my head and think that's the most insane thing I've ever seen. It's like a death wish, because
it's not just trucks, Dean.
Yeah,
it's cars too. And I mean, I've seen cars cut in front of trucks coming over like a slush bank in the middle of, when it snows and you got those slush, I call them slush banks, but the pieces of snow in the middle.
Yep.
I've seen cars cut right in front of trucks and drive like it's I remember every time it snowed, especially the first snowstorm, I would always stay home. Because I just said to the people I was working with at that point, I was like, listen, I have no interest in spending 5 hours in traffic,
right,
to get to work for 4 hours, to spend 5 hours in traffic coming home.
Yeah.
Because everybody just seems to forget how to drive in winter.
Yeah.
And they forget about the increased distances. They forget about all of this. And we see it a lot, and you guys probably see it as well.
Yep.
On the 400 series highways here. One of the big, it's either the first snowstorm, the first big snowstorm, and then we also find the snowstorms like in April,
right,
where you have that kind of that one last freak storm that usually happens. It usually happens when we're on vacation, because we tend to giggle at everybody on Instagram when they're like, "Oh my God, we got snow," and we're like sitting in the sun.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because people are so quick to get their winter tires off,
right.
And then now they're circling all over the place,
Yeah, I think I mean this is a fascinating time, because I know that Dan Einwechter at Challenger Motor Freight has already had his drivers through winter training class. Most of your fleets already have drivers through preparing for winter pretty early, because it takes time to get the right trucks, the right equipment, chains on trailers if you've taken them off, and getting everybody ready for it. But I think this will catch a lot of people out, especially if snowstorms are happening earlier than usual. So, add in, really bad weather on I-80, which is a massive produce corridor out of California. Add in Diwali Festival this week, where the Punjab population celebrates the Festival of Lights in Lodi, California this week, where a lot of the Punjab drivers take time off. They take the week off, and capacity tightens and it's hard to move produce. So when you get things like this piling up, that's when it starts to impact the freight market. So we'll know more on the next week how that panned out. But the fact that we're in late October and we've already got Interstate 80 closed down, we've got measurable snow up in the Sierra Nevadas, further south down towards Truckee, or a little bit further sort of southwest of where Laramie and Rawlings are. It tells you that we're already into winter, and if you're not prepared now, it's almost too late. So this is Dan. Talk about crazy weather. We've got 70 degrees here on Friday in New England. It's down in the 40s. We've got heavy fall in terms of all the leaves are down. We've had our first frost, and then it's going to be 70 degrees on Friday after Halloween. Yeah. Like, that's just nuts.
Yeah, we're in the same boat. We've had frost probably a dozen times already.
Yeah.
All the plants are dead.
Yep.
Cut down everything, and then we're going to be in the 25s this week.
Yeah.
It's almost like we used to call it, and I don't know if this is politically correct anymore, so I apologize, everyone. But I have only ever known it as an Indian summer.
Right.
And I don't know if there's new verbiage for it now. So, but it's this. Before it was, and I remember as a kid, and I guess this is part of global warming. Maybe it's not, maybe it's just what happens. But I remember as a kid, there was always this like point. I mean, as a kid, I remember trick-or-treating, and never did I have a Halloween costume that wasn't able to put a snowsuit underneath it.
Right.
Because I can't tell you how many Halloweens there was snow on the ground in Quebec. It was crazy. There wasn't anything like, I mean, I've been out on Halloween. I've been out with a toque, and I've been out with a t-shirt. giving out candy on Halloween. Like it's just, it's so sporadic. It's crazy.
Yeah.
You know, it brings me to another question though, Dean. If it's this sporadic and companies are running these corridors that we know there's, you know, for lack of a better term, like, I don't even know what the word would be, but, you know, inconsistent weather patterns. So we'll put it like that.
Right.
You know, weather patterns that can catch you off guard. Why wouldn't companies say to themselves, okay, so if a driver's coming through here, you know, they might leave on the Wednesday. Meteorologists are always wrong.
Yep.
So coming back on the Saturday, we have like, you really don't know. And sometimes you don't even know, well, up here anyway, sometimes we don't even get the proper weather up to an hour before it happens.
Yeah.
So like, can we really trust them? Why would they not go ahead and start the training early, especially with new drivers? It's almost as if they're throwing them into the pit of lions and saying, fend for yourself.
Well, some do, Dan. I think some are probably a little bit careless when it comes to that. Most train their drivers, though. So here's the thing with weather. Most drivers are taught, you know, about driving in adverse weather conditions. So it's one thing knowing about it. It's the other thing experiencing it and learning from your poor judgment. Yes, right? Okay. So you've got to go through this stuff to become a better driver. So I, you know, speaking as a driver that's done a few million miles and got into some serious trouble because of, you know, ice and snow. Most drivers are aware, you know, it's like a life preservation skill. Like, you know, when you get into snow and ice, you're on the precipice of losing your life if you get it wrong. That's different if there's a gust of wind or a heavy rainstorm. Like when you get right on that slippery edge of losing control, that's a very serious situation. And unfortunately, a lot of drivers are not prepared for it because they do simple things like A, drive too fast, or B, not have a CB radio and they're disconnected from what's going on up ahead of them. But what they'll typically do is they'll go for the foot brake first instead of the trailer brake on the handpiece. Like, so, you know, the first rule is if you get into adverse weather is put your trailer brakes on, don't touch the foot brake. Right, because you're braking from behind. That avoids a jackknife in the, you know, initially. So little things like that most drivers don't do, and they get themselves into trouble. But I think
you're just used to hitting the brakes when you're in a car. If you're a new driver, even though you've been trained, the instinct is to hit the brake. Yeah,
I now, like if I get in any serious trouble, my first reaction is the handpiece. Right, I just go for the trolley brake, they call it here. I'll put that on first and pull myself slow down from behind, not trying to get the truck to stop the trailer coming if it's loaded. So little things like that can save your life. But I think most drivers can react to whether they can see and feel and smell, you know, fires, wind, rain. You kind of have a spidey sense about how bad is bad. What gets you into trouble is stuff you can't see, like ice. Like, so most drivers will keep going, you know, through this because most weather is sort of nothing bad happens, but it's not until you get a crosswind when you're empty or you get black ice on a bridge, right? So that sort of stuff becomes life-threatening. A lot of drivers don't, you know, heed the warnings about, you know, the bridge ice, air under the bridge freezes, right? Freezes the bridge first. But so I think most truckers are aware of how bad is bad. The more experienced drivers will pull up. They will shut down, Dan. Like they'll get into a rest area and they will shut down. The really advanced companies, and maybe advanced is not the right way to describe this, but the tech savvy companies are very good at integrating weather into their dispatch. So they'll use weather down to the 1 or 2 kilometer footprint, real-time weather data feeds, feed that in, look at the geo map of all of their trucks and look at all the, you know, the dots within the weather geo fence where there's a tornadic activity or something, and the messages will go out to the trucks to shut down. And some of them I've even seen calibrate the alerts to the driver based on the tenure of the driver. So if it's a new driver in a severe storm on the I-80 in Laramie, the message will come out, pull over immediately in a safe place or something like that. I've seen that work. Transport America are very good at that in Minneapolis. They did a great job at that. So I think most companies, nearly every truckload carrier I know has a weather person and a weather data feed, and some of it's canned messages. You know, we've got a storm out of the Sierra Nevadas, be careful. right down to, hey, we've got high winds at North Platte on I-80, you need to shut down, right? Because 3 trucks have already blown over. Stuff like that. So I think most fleets are fairly adept at that. But when you get down to smaller size fleets, I think that's where you see more problems, because they don't have the technology integrations to do that in real time, and therefore rely on the driver looking out the windscreen to make his best judgment. And that's where you see a lot of drivers get into trouble, because they, Dan, experience comes from poor judgment. Right.
Yeah.
That's why
unfortunately we have to fail in order to get better.
Right. So I mean, that's the same that applies.
So you also finding, obviously with pattern switching, lane switching with carriers, obviously looking to the spot market to get better rates or something. What's your thoughts on, and I guess we wouldn't have data on this, but more from your professional time behind the wheel. I'm seeing carriers move lanes, kind of following the money, if you will, for lack of a better term.
We've been encouraging it all year. So as the market's been soft, what we've been saying to carriers is use the technology to find alternate lanes where the volumes are. Follow the money. A lot of carriers will tell you that comes, there's a risk and reward that comes with that, because familiarity can be very profitable. If you're running the same lane with the same customers and the same shippers, even if you're in the spot market, right? Customers love that. They love the same truck, the same driver, the same treatment. Like, drivers love familiarity and continuity. So when you start to change that, you start to have different service issues, because drivers are unfamiliar with the territory. You've got to know your distances, your times, your terrain, your wind patterns, your traffic patterns to get from A to B without running out of hours. Timing your rest breaks, all that stuff comes into the equation. When you start running new lanes, it takes time to learn that. But that's the risk side of it. The reward side of it is you can actually be making more revenue per truck day. And we've actually actively encouraged carriers to do that this year. Remember on a show earlier this year, we talked about +1 -10, which was Todd Amon's, do one more load a month and slow down 10 miles an hour and put 20 grand on your bottom line. So I think we've been encouraging carriers to do much more of that, because I think as the manufacturing side of our business has affected different commodity types, we've seen lane imbalance emerge, where lower volume on some lane, it's caused carriers to look differently. So we're heading back towards, seasonality has clearly emerged in our market. It will lift the market. There'll be some surges on some lanes, and some carriers won't be able to handle it, and the spot market will jump in to play that critical role. But I think we've seen incredible volatility right now, Dan, with the fallout from Hurricanes Helene and Milton. When you want to talk about lane imbalance and some lanes falling off a cliff and others surging, think about the volume of Canadian lumber that's making its way down into the southeast, and the lower volumes of freight coming out of the southeast because it's still recovering. We've just read reports that so think about Florida's the biggest, that they're in the strawberry planting season right now, where Hurricane Milton whipped across the middle of the state. That's strawberry territory. The planting season is now, which has been impacted severely. So fast forward to February, when you see peak strawberry production that starts the 25 produce season, right? You can already see that strawberry prices will be pretty high, but that'll affect truckload volumes northbound out of Florida.
So there's another thing that I've noticed over the last probably week and a half. Working with a specific company who typically was always in that Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina area. Customer of ours has stuff, Ohio, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, all these kind of things. And they're like, well, I'll take those. And I remember I was saying to one of my teammates, I was going, but that's not really where they go. And they were saying, no, it's because their lanes that they normally do are no longer there. And that's specifically why I was asking you how carriers flip, right? Because they're a great company,
right?
But we found there was some service failures And it was like, oh, I didn't realize this. And
Right.
it was because they moved lanes, right?
Yep.
So it wasn't intentional. They still wanted to service at the highest level.
Right.
But we just found there was this almost an imbalance.
Yep.
And, you know, it was interesting that you just said Diwali Festival, because this week we've been having a hard time out of California. And I never put it to the Diwali Festival. But I'm wondering if that's the piece. And you see, so everybody watching and listening, this is why this show is so critical, because you're going to get these insights that you would not normally get in another show, right? And so,
yeah, again, just pause on that. The data is fascinating from the Punjabi Trucking Association. Punjab Sikhs make up 20% of the country's truckers, but as much as 40% of the industry in California. Like it is a staggering number. It's one of the biggest trucking associations on the planet. So when you have a festival that affects all of them from a religious point of view, you want to bet you're finding it hard time to move trucks. But Dan, they don't celebrate Christmas like a lot of other people do. So what you find is, as this demographic has emerged, the seasonality where you see capacity tighten up as drivers go home for Christmas is picked up. The slack is picked up by another demographic that keeps rolling, because they're not celebrating Christmas. That's a whole new world.
Dean, you make such a point there, because there was always this. I remember years ago, major Canadian company was mostly Russian, and Thanksgiving they always ran.
Yep.
And then I remember speaking with Vlad, one of the guys in ops, and I remember saying, like, you always have availability around this time where most companies don't. He goes, yeah. He goes, nah, Thanksgiving, don't worry about it. We move.
Right.
And, you know, you start looking at the different demographics, I guess. Is demographics the right word? Or I guess maybe religions, demographics, whatever, in the industry.
Yep.
And you're right. When one drops off, the other one picks up. Right. And then you also see, you know, if we're talking about the Punjab community, right? When they go on vacation for like a month, or sometimes 2 months, right? Because they'll go back to India and they'll visit family member and they'll stay for a long time. Whereas I the first thing I saw when I got in this industry, when I realized that was, you know, my first, how could you go away for a month? It's like, well, listen, I work 7 days a week for so long that I take the month off. And as I got deeper and became more and more friends with people in the Punjab community, I realized that, you know, we go away for a week 3-4 times a year, right? Most, you know, to call it 2 times a year, once a year, but we go away for a week. They work their butts off like 6-7 days a week for 8 to 10 months and then take 2 months off. So it's that cultural diversity. I think that is really phenomenal in our industry.
Dan, it's something that's emerged in the last 5 to 6 years. Maybe it's longer. Certainly since I've been watching it, is the different, you know, they started out minority groups and then they've become majority groups, whether it be Eastern Bloc. We've got, you know, a lot of drivers from, you know, you see a lot of Haitian drivers, from South America in particular, a lot of drivers from Mexico. So there's lots of folks make up our industry.
There was a big European push a decade and a half ago. I think we had a huge European come in. I remember that because I remember there was, and there's always going to be this language barrier, I think, at the initial start, right? And then there was, so it's interesting, and that's, you know what, there might be, you and I should actually sit down and probably do a show with what are the major events in a calendar year that impact trucking. Maybe give our listeners a roadmap. That would be pretty cool. I'd be really interested in that. So before we get going, I know there's one last beast we got to tame here, which is the good old Montreal Port. Dean, CN put out a notice yesterday that they've officially ceased operations prior to the port shutting down. There was a you know, obviously this goes back for everybody watching and listening, just before the ILA strike, when ILA was going on. I think it was Tuesday at midnight or Monday at midnight. Port of Montreal on a Friday morning or a Thursday morning said they're striking for 72 hours as of Friday night. Put a huge, call it clusterfuck, into the whole process in the Port of Montreal. Where are they at now? What are you hearing from your end?
I'm Mike Engel from Journal of Commerce put out a piece yesterday afternoon, and I think it's only the Termont International Terminal, right?
Yeah.
The other two terminals, and I forget their names, is it Racine and Cass? Those two terminals won't be affected by the work stoppage. But Mike's article is very interesting on the Journal of Commerce, says that it's going to impact, will idle around 1 million TEUs of Montreal's 2.3 million TEUs in terminal capacity. So it's going to sit down a lot of containers.
Yeah, I think Termont's the biggest one.
Yeah, and I think it's impacting MSC, so Mediterranean Shipping Company's container service primarily. So they voted to authorize an indefinite strike targeting half of the port's container capacity. So that's about the latest. And I think it started as a boycott and overtime at the port back in October. So I think this is just part of a rolling series of strikes. Now, Montreal's the largest port, am I right, in Canada?
So I think on the East Coast,
Right.
I'm gonna say the BC ports are probably bigger.
Okay.
I'll have to get data
Vancouver.
on that.
No,
but
you're right. Vancouver, is the largest.
Yeah.
Yeah. Vancouver's the largest, but I think I'm just trying to quickly look up some data here. Port of Vancouver, one of the biggest ports in Canada.
Delta Port, I think, is the largest in Canada.
Yeah, Montreal's number 2, right? So it goes Vancouver, Montreal, Prince Rupert, Halifax, St. John. So Montreal is the second. It's the biggest on the East Coast. I think that's what you said. So yeah, it's a pretty big deal. And of course, Dan.
Well, it is, and the infrastructure to get in and out is absolutely asinine in that area. There's been construction in the La Fontaine Tunnel for years. I think it's over now, but then the first big rainfall, it flooded, and I remember dealing with the port all the way back from till 2010, 15 years ago almost.
Yeah,
it was just crazy to get in and out. I mean, the wait times were crazy 15 years ago. I couldn't even imagine what the kind of wait times are now.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal. And of course, you start to get into winter in the St. Lawrence Seaway and they remove the navigation aids and, it starts to freeze up. That becomes a pretty big deal. That limits the type of vessels in terms of their hull design, their ability to withhandle ice. But you're a long way from the St. Lawrence freezing, if I understand weather patterns right now. It would be after the new year, right?
Yeah, usually. I mean, Montreal gets a little bit, not a little bit. Montreal gets different weather than Toronto because they're just way further north. Like a lot of, visually when you look at it, you're like, oh, they're not really. But when you look at the height of Montreal compared to like Ontario, you're up in that Sudbury range, right?
Oh.
So it's more in the snow belt than Toronto would be, for example. However, as going back to the beginning of the show, the patterns in Ontario and Quebec are disastrous. Like last year, Quebec had very little cold, very little snow, everything. Like every one of my snowmobiling friends went to Quebec and left 4 days early, where normally they want to stay for the entire snowmobile season because it's so good, right? So it all depends on that weather. That then you also have, when they do get a lot of snow, their streets are more congested, the snowbanks are higher. You know what I mean? There's all this kind of stuff that slows down production, or not production, but slows down trucking and slows down the P&D and the local stuff.
Got it.
There's all these different variables that we're facing.
Yep.
I think one of the biggest, from what I'm seeing, and in my opinion, one of the biggest things we're facing in our industry right now, is this ocean OTR connection, right? Speaking to a lot of my customers that are bringing freight in, they're still impacted by the ILA strikes.
Oh yeah,
they're still moving product from the West Coast all the way to the East Coast, paying $5,000-$6,000 a truckload to get it done because of the backup. Like there's all these financial impacts, and it's very fragile, I guess is the word.
Well, it's not over though, Dan. Like January 15.
No, I know.
There's a chance there's a very high probability that they'll strike again on January 15. So you've already got, to your point about diversions to the West Coast, you've got shippers diversions, which is the Red Sea issue, right? So you've got diversions, extra transit time, shippers pulling forward volumes, front loading their volumes to get ahead of that. And the ILA strike, and now obviously the Montreal strike is having the agreement hasn't been reached there with the Canadian port workers. You can see shippers very nervous about getting imports in, because we're heading into a shipping period in the new year, which is the push to get imports in ahead of Chinese New Year.
Yes.
And the 3-week shutdown.
Well, and also you have restocking for Black Friday, Christmas,
all that
Cyber
stuff.
Monday,
Yeah, so,
all this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah. So Dan, it's an interesting thought. Do you think we're going to pay for this? Because this is pulling forward volume without necessarily demand driving it. So we're pulling forward volume from a time in the future. And that time in the future is starting to get into first quarter, which is always a bad quarter anyway.
Yeah,
so think about,
I'm going to say yes.
Yeah.
Here's one thing that because I've been asking a lot of customers these questions. I'm going to say probably 85% of my customers are at 130% capacity, which is crazy to think the amount of product they have, to the point where one customer, if a truck is late, it literally pushes every truck back.
Right.
Because they just can't pull the stock. They have nowhere to put it. And they're still bringing stuff in because of the Chinese New Year, because of restocking, because of this. And I think at some point, for the companies that are doing this, there's two ways it can go, Dean, right? Shareholders, companies make less profits, or we pay more. And I think that's the only two routes it can go.
Yeah.
When we look at things like Winners, and HomeSense up here, that has Christmas stuff out 2 weeks before Halloween has even happened.
Right.
It tells me they're overstocked. It tells me they have to start, getting the, the people that would prefer to have a Christmas tree up in October as opposed to a pumpkin on the front porch. I mean, I don't know what's happened. Like, I'm still puzzled as to why, because I'm sure you recall, there was always this on the 31st, right after Halloween. It immediately, when you went into the stores on the 1st of November, it was Christmas.
Yeah.
Right. Now it's like I remember you, Jeff, and I talking, I think midsummer or beginning of the summer, Home Depot had Christmas stuff in their aisles just to purge it out of the warehouse, because I think at some point we have to stop and say, one, does it cost more to sell it at a discount or to keep it?
Right. Well, I think a lot of people not sell it. Well, a lot of people got caught during the pandemic, right? Because they didn't have the inventory and they lost revenue, they lost sales. So it's like we've gone to the other end of the scale, which is let's have it just in case, so we don't get caught short, because the holding cost of excess inventory, I think, is far less than the lost revenue from not having the goods in the first place, was how it was described to me from shippers.
Yeah, and I see that, but then you got to think, if you got to hold that for 12 to 24 months, at what point does that turn into a red mark on your P&L as opposed to a black one?
Yeah,
right?
Dan,
and I think this is what's going to be happening over the next little. I think, one of my words for 2025, I believe, is going to be cleanup.
Cleanup.
So me, Dean, every year I pick two words for the industry. Like this year was collaboration and cost plus. Next year I think is going to be cleanup, and more or less relationships.
Right.
And when I say relationships, I'm not talking about, this person. It's like, how do you keep me ahead of the change curve?
Right. It's a really good point.
That's like the experience matters relationship.
Yeah, I think I talked about this at DatCon last week, where those that are left standing are going to be in pretty good shape when this market starts to seriously take off. And that's both brokers, shippers. I'm sure carriers are in the same boat, because if you can figure out a way to get through the last 2 years on the downside and bottoming out of this market, and then still be standing next year to provide all those services, you've done something incredibly good. Like, you don't underestimate how successful you have to have been to get through this freight cycle and then weather the storm of the first quarter and then come out the other side a lot stronger.